As you've seen, this is the first of a 4-part series we're doing every Wednesday morning for the next 4 Wednesdays, and really excited for the lineup of willing speakers and farmers who are engaging in this conversation. My name is Becky Maden, and I work with UVM Extension on nutrient management and soil health. And I also have a small farm in Orwell. And I just wanted to pause to acknowledge that the land I'm farming on, and a lot of us are farming on, is unceded Abenaki land, and just have a lot of gratitude for where we live, and especially in this moment in time with lots of things that feel like they're coming apart in the world. To be where we are right now is really special. So I'm going to kick it off just reminding everybody of Zoom logistics, keeping yourself muted. And if you have questions, type them in the chat. I'll try to moderate those as we go along. We're going to have everyone talk for about 15 minutes and then have 5 minutes for quick questions, and then 20 minutes at the end for discussion. If you're unable to stay, you can ask the speakers questions afterwards over email or contact me. And like I said, there will be a recording posted. So I'm gonna hand it over to Joshua. And he's gonna start out talking about the basics of phosphorus and nitrogen management. And Joshua is one of the spectacular UVM Extension folks that I get to work with. He's a climate change specialist, the Center for Sustainable Agriculture. So go ahead, Joshua. Thanks for sharing today.
Thanks, Becky. All right, so good morning, everyone. Good to be here. I'm just going to kick things off here with what I hope will be a little bit of framing and foundational material before we move on to discussions about what Hilary and Christa are doing on their farms related to this kind of topic of soil health, and really where I'm coming from is kind of trying to focus on water quality as well, given the program today and some of the other work that I do. This is where I spend a lot of my time, so I'm going to try to kind of keep a water quality bent to the material that I'll present here related to agriculture and phosphorus and nitrogen management on our farms. Okay, so we all know that we have nationwide some serious ag and water quality challenges. This is a really just striking photo from the shoreline of Ohio and Lake Erie, and one of these harmful algal blooms that occurs during the summer months on occasion up there, that is really fueled by phosphorus loss from farmland. And we know we have similar issues here in the Champlain Basin, maybe not to the degree that they do in the Erie Basin, but we have overloaded our lake with phosphorus, and I'm showing this because this has been touted around a lot, and this shows that agriculture is, about 40% of the issue of and when it comes to phosphorus loss and delivery to the lake. What's not discussed, I think, very often is also that nitrate is a concern as well, and this is from the Agency of Ag, Food and Markets Groundwater Monitoring Program from 2007 to 2017, showing nitrate concentrations in drinking water wells or just groundwater wells on or near farms. And so 80% of these are below a 5 parts per million level, which is there's no concern there. Once you get over 5 parts per million, you start to kind of throw some flags and say, hey, this is creeping up a little bit higher than it should be. And then our EPA establishes a maximum contaminant level of 10 parts per million, at which action needs to be taken. There are some human health concerns when we get over that level. And then, so I think what maybe is even kind of frames this a little better is if you look at the green box there on the lower right-hand side of your screen, that we have about 6% of wells on or near farms that have maximum contaminant levels over 10 ppm, and then only about 0.5% of non-farm wells were over that 10 ppm. So, just to kind of make the point that we have the proximity of water resources to farms puts them in a little bit of a precarious position. And then, so maybe to shock you a little bit this morning, kind of wake you up, you know, I do a lot of work with larger, I work with all types of farms, but a lot of work with field crop systems as well. And I think that, you know, a lot of the responsibility is put on the shoulders of those large farms, because it's those farms that are causing the water quality issues, right? And so I would push back on that a little bit. And you know, we don't have a lot of vegetable production land in the state, but I think that there's reason to take notice here. And I'm showing a soil health report from a vegetable farm in Chittenden County. I have a few of these I'm going to show you. And soil health on this farm is actually not so great. They're in a transition period. And so you can see the different scores on this farm. I don't want to walk through all of these different indicators for soil health that Cornell goes through, but I will focus on that red box down there, where their extractable phosphorus levels in their soil are over the high level. And actually the high level starts around 20 parts per million, and this farm is up to 40 parts per million. Here's another vegetable farm in Chittenden County where again, just good soil health all across the board, except for that red box again, where extractable phosphorus is up over 130 parts per million in their soils. And then the kicker here at the end, another vegetable farm in Chittenden County where extractable phosphorus concentrations were over 1,000. And I have never seen soils with this high of concentration of phosphorus. So just to kind of, again, hopefully wake you up a little bit and say, hey, you know, I think it's important for us to take notice of these issues as well in the vegetable community. And then for nitrogen, here is this is from a paper in the late 90s where they did some modeled nitrogen losses that have been somewhat verified by field measurements since then. And this is looking at different vegetable crops and the amount of nitrate leaching that we could see from those individual crops, both with a sandy soil and a clay soil. And so I've circled the leaching losses in those red rectangles there. And you can see that what I think I kind of like to look at is just the total for each of the crops for the leaching losses. And this is in kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. And I have a little conversion factor up there in the upper left-hand corner for those who don't deal in metric. I don't either. But 100 kilograms per hectare is about 89 pounds per acre. And you can see that from these crops, which are commonly grown in Vermont, of course, we can see anywhere from 81 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen lost from Brussels sprouts, 130 in cabbage, 184 in leeks, and then spinach really takes the cake with potential for 251 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare lost. That's a combination of what's you know, residual nitrogen in the soil, and then from potential crop residue degradation at the end of the season after the spinach tops are harvested. And we actually see very similar losses between the sandy soil and the clay soils. Okay, so hopefully that woke you up a little bit. Now I want to get into some of the a little bit of the science of phosphorus and nitrogen, and then we'll talk a bit more about management. So this may be review for some of you, and it may be new for some of you, but I think these are important points to kind of hammer on so that we understand how these nutrients cycle in our ag systems and move through our soil, or don't move through our soil in some instances. So the key characteristic of phosphorus, I think, is that it sorbs tightly to soil particles. And so that means it accumulates in the soil, especially in upper soils, in the surface soils, because it doesn't leach down through near as much in most cases, like nitrogen does. And so I'm showing a study where they looked at manure phosphorus accumulation in soils with different application rates. You can see the higher the the manure P is applied, the greater the concentration of that phosphorus in those upper soils. And really, the way phosphorus becomes distributed within soils is through tillage. And so in soils where no-till soils or hay or pasture, things like that don't get tilled, that's where we start to really accumulate phosphorus on the surface, because we're not tilling that in, and that phosphorus bonds so immediately when it comes in contact with the soil particles. And there is free phosphorus too as well, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And so phosphorus accumulates to a point, and so that was something I failed to mention. And then once we reach a saturation level in the soil, that's when that phosphorus is subject to runoff. And so this also goes hand in hand with how phosphorus improves yield. And this is kind of a basic kind of conceptual figure that is shown a lot in nutrient management planning courses, where we have this critical level where we can add phosphorus to a soil from a very low to a medium soil test level, and have yield benefits as phosphorus concentrations in the soil. But then once we hit that critical level of phosphorus concentration, we see no further yield benefit with additional phosphorus applications. And in some cases, at very high concentrations, we can actually see a yield detriment because of additional phosphorus applications. And so there's two different forms of phosphorus that we talk about and we study in runoff studies. One is dissolved phosphorus. And the literature shows that by and large, this is the primary form of phosphorus loss from no-till systems, pasture and hay systems, but no-till systems that don't have exposed soils that can be eroded and lost from a field. And then there's sediment-bound phosphorus. And this is the dominant, even though there is dissolved phosphorus losses from tilled systems and systems where there's lots of exposed soil, because of the erosion that occurs in those systems, the primary form of phosphorus loss is that sediment-bound phosphorus from those types of farming lands. And so we have two different P-loss pathways. And for anyone who's ever fiddled around with the phosphorus index, you may be familiar with this. It's part of Go Crop, or part of a nutrient management plan. If your farm is required to do one of those, then encompass a P index. These are kind of the way we approach phosphorus loss within that phosphorus index tool. And so there's surface runoff. This is absolutely the dominant pathway, even in systems that have subsurface loss of phosphorus. Surface runoff still seems to be the dominant pathway of phosphorus loss. And like I said, this is both from erosion of soil particles that hold phosphorus and from dissolved phosphorus leaving the field as water interacts with that surface soil. Again, that surface soil, remember, is highly enriched with phosphorus because it binds so tightly to it when you first put it on. But then once it reaches that saturation point and water interacts with it, it can be removed from that soil. And then we have subsurface runoff, and this can occur. Phosphorus can leach. Again, once we hit that saturation point in a soil where we kind of a maximum concentration level, and that can be reached fairly quickly in coarse grained soils, sandy soils, a lot of the soils we use for vegetable production, then we can leach phosphorus, and it will move down into the soil profile. It could bind to lower soils within the root zone, or it could just leach on downward into shallow groundwater or into drainage tile if there is drainage tile present in the field. When we talk about phosphorus a lot, or I'm sorry, drainage tile a lot, in reference to dairy and our field crop systems, and that's what seems to get the attention. But then if you look at Heather Darby did some survey work a couple years ago, and actually on a percentage basis, there's more vegetable land and vegetable farmers that are installing tile drainage than there are dairy farmers. And so I think it's important for us to kind of understand these mechanisms as well, and the risk that may be present there in our fields. And so for drainage tile, we also, it's not just dissolved phosphorus. We see, especially in soils, no-till soils, soils that have macropores that are really well structured, we actually can see particulate phosphorus, soil particles moving down into our tile lines as well. So on the vegetable farm, what should we do about this? And I think that for us, that most of us are, of course, using have tilled management systems. So the key way that we can address phosphorus loss on the vegetable farm is by reducing erosion and reducing soil loss. And so to kind of come back to, or what I give a lot of presentations on soil health, and kind of the 3 principles of soil health that I really like to harp on are these 3 here. Soil cover, building organic matter, and reduce disturbance. And I think these are I'm an engineer, I'm a little bit of a reductionist, but I think these are the most important principles to me. And it's really a matter of finding what works for you in your management system and in your cropping systems, that you can adhere to these principles as much as you can. And so I'll just want to walk through some of these principles and some of the management options that you have within those kind of buckets of principles. So soil cover, preferably living cover, but just plain physical cover goes a long way toward preventing erosion. Whether it's mulch, straw, plant residue, whatever it may be, that physical cover prevents raindrops from hitting the soil aggregates. Raindrops fall at about terminal velocity is about 19 feet per second, and when it hits, it's like a crater hitting the surface of a planet, if you see in the cartoons, and it blows apart those soil aggregates, that force of the raindrop, and then those individual soil constituents, the sand, the silt, and the clay, the little bitty pieces, are more subject to runoff, and that's what holds the phosphorus. So we're trying to protect those aggregates by keeping our soils covered. And I have a really good photo of how that functions there on the right side of the screen. This is a rainfall simulation where I took just tilled soils side by side in the field, took trays of those soils. On one, I placed just some straw, and one there was no straw, and then I rained on those soils. And you can see the runoff in the front bucket there, that the front bucket is full of water from the soil that was not covered, and very little water came off the one that was covered. And the water is also loaded, it's chocolate milk-like, loaded with sediment and nutrients on the soil that was not covered. And where in the soil that was covered, all of the water infiltrated into that soil, and you can see it in the back bucket that kind of sits underneath those trays, and those trays are perforated. So really fantastic tool for taking processes that occur at a landscape scale and shrinking them down so that we can actually see them. It's amazing when you do this demonstration, and you just see light bulbs go on audience as people kind of understand how that soil cover functions. Okay, and building organic matter. This is our second principle, and this can be done a number of different ways. The organic matter is important. It's important for water retention, but when we think about water quality, it's important because it's the fuel that feeds the biology in the soil, that build the soil aggregates. That's the key to it, right? It's that active carbon in that organic matter that allows our soil critters to create the glues and build the aggregates, and we need those aggregates to resist the erosion and the phosphorus loss. So you can build organic matter in a number of ways, through cover cropping, root exudates that come from cover crop roots, organic fertility sources instead of synthetic fertility sources, crop rotations. Lots of work has been done on all of these to see how we can increase organic matter of soils. Our third principle, reduce disturbance. And this is important because the more we disturb a soil, the more we expose that organic matter that the biology need. We expose that organic matter to oxidation in the atmosphere, and so we lose that organic matter when we disturb our soils. We also disrupt the biology in their little micro habitats within the soil. There are critters that like to live on the surface. There's some that like to live in the middle of the root zone, some that like to live at the bottom of the root zone. Every time we till that up, we kind of, throw their world in disarray. And it takes time for them to reassemble themselves. So reducing that disturbance, reducing tillage frequency, reducing tillage intensity are key ways that we can reduce that disturbance of the soil. Okay, and now I'm going to jump into nitrogen. I think I have a few more minutes here. I can finish this up before in the next 3 or 4 minutes. So the nitrogen cycle. So there's a lot going on in the nitrogen cycle. I just want to hit some high points here and then focus on one key mechanism that occurs in the nitrogen cycle. So we apply, whether it's organic nitrogen in manures or inorganic nitrogen in fertilizers into the soil that comes in as ammonium, and then primarily in the inorganic fertilizers, and then it comes in as organic nitrogen in the manures, and then it goes through a mineralization process into ammonium. That ammonium, an important point here is that doesn't move much in the soil. It's positively charged. We talk about cation exchange capacity in the soil. Ammonium binds to the soil and doesn't move very well. Plants can use it, but when we're in a saturated system, when there's lots of rainfall, perhaps in the spring, that ammonium can become nitrified into nitrate, and that's that NO3 on the right-hand side of the screen, and that's negatively charged. So that means it does not bind to soil particles. It moves just like water. It's very, very slippery in the soil. And that's when we start to have environmental concern, when we have that nitrate present in the soil. That's when we get leaching. That's the majority of environmental loss, and it moves downward through the soil, especially our sandy soils. We can also have denitrification when we have saturated soils, and that's a gaseous loss of nitrate. Not so much an environmental concern, but certainly a concern from an agronomic perspective. So how do we manage for reduced nitrate, nitrogen leaching? First, we need to understand our vulnerable soils, sandy soils, well-drained soils, tiled soils. All these should be at the top of the list in terms of our soils that are at risk for nitrogen loss. So I think that's the first step. Then we should try to minimize any residual nitrogen present within our soils. And this is done primarily through your nitrogen management plan and potentially PSNT testing. So testing how much nitrogen is present within the root zone of the soil, and if we need to add any more additional nitrogen to meet the plant needs. So we just need to keep a really tight nitrogen budget. That's the key to minimizing the residual nitrogen. And then at the end of the season, we can try to scavenge any residual nitrogen that is present there, and we primarily would do that with cover crops that would grow in the off season and utilize that nitrogen, residual nitrogen in the soil, and keep it from being subject to leaching in the late fall, winter, and early spring. And then irrigation management can also become important. And this would just be a simple matter of avoiding over application. We don't want saturated soils within our root zone. When we have saturated soils in the root zone, that's when we have that leaching, that downward movement of water. And that's when we can lose that nitrogen. So the leaching season. Just a few couple more slides here on when our riskiest times for leaching are. Leaching occurs in the fall and in the spring, and this is when we don't have a growing crop to take up that nitrogen, and this is when we have no ET, no evapotranspiration. Plants are not using water in the soil, so it's more prone to saturating that soil. And again, that saturation is when we have the potential for downward water movement and downward nitrogen movement. So this can be addressed with that cover crop. When we plant that in the fall, then we have a crop on the soil that's utilizing that nitrogen, keeping it from being leached through the winter, and then especially in the spring when that cover crop really comes on. Starts to explode in the spring. It's keeping all that nitrogen from leaching, and we minimize those nitrogen leaching windows to when in between the primary crop and the cover crop. And then for irrigation management, I just want to show one slide here from some work we've done in Addison County looking at how do we minimize the leaching of nitrogen, minimize the saturation of soils in the root zone. And this is in a drip irrigation system. For the purposes of today, I just want you to ignore the top half of this figure and just focus on the blue and the green lines at the bottom and that red circle. So these are in some vegetable crops. And when that blue line becomes horizontal, this is when we have saturated our soil tension is at a minimum amount. And we've been able to monitor this with soil moisture sensors. And when we have that flat line, this is 12 inches down in the soil, our soil profile is saturated, and this is when we are leaching soil. So just one tool that I think we can think about using in drip irrigation systems to try to minimize that, tighten up our irrigation management and scheduling so that we can minimize that nitrogen leaching. Okay, that was my last slide. I am going to stop sharing, and I think we have just a few minutes for questions.
Thanks, Joshua. That was a lot of information in 15 minutes. Thank you so much. I think there's just, awesome, thank you. There's just two questions, I think. The first is from Chaya, and she asks does phosphorus show up differently on soil reports depending on time of year? For example, does it underreport in early spring when soils are colder?
I don't know that temperature necessarily is a large factor. We recommend soil testing in the fall. You can certainly have a skewed soil phosphorus test report if you test within New York State, for example. Cornell recommends a 6-week window between phosphorus applications and testing. So you would not want to do a soil test within a month and a half after you've applied your phosphorus source or your nutrient source. That would be the primary. That's the primary thing that would affect your P score. Or it can certainly be affected by liming application as well. Liming tends to free up phosphorus. I think most of us are aware of that.
Yeah, and I would just add that in general, we recommend soil testing at relatively the same time every year, kind of more for other nutrients than for phosphorus. Yep. So if I don't think it matters, but you could test in the fall or spring or summer, but kind of maintain consistency from year to year. Question from Suzanne Long, is the high nitrogen loss in your early vegetable slide mostly due to excess nitrogen application for various crops, or are there other factors at play?
I think that's a big part of it. Yeah, not having a tight nitrogen budget. This was prior to where nitrogen management planning became more important and more regulated. So I think that's a big piece of it. I think that part of it is high plant residual as well that's left on the field. So that you have a trade-off there. You can maintain good soil cover with plant residue, but then you also, of course, in any organic matter, there is nitrogen and phosphorus in that organic matter as well. So when it decomposes, it could be subject to loss.
Awesome. Do you have time for one more question,
Josh? Yeah, sure.
Ryan's wondering if by increasing organic matter in soil, does that by nature increase nitrogen and phosphorus to excess, adding compost year after year, for example?
Not in and of itself. Just adding organic matter doesn't mean we have an excess of phosphorus or nitrogen. I think that by and large, on balance, the benefit is positive from adding organic matter, but it's all organic matter is not created equally. There's organic matter with the compost, high P compost, high P manure composts versus low P composts and manures. We just have to understand what the nutrient content is of the organic matter that we're adding and what the status of the soil is after that addition.
And your favorite question, is there a particular moisture meter that you?
Oh, yeah. So we're not allowed to talk about brands, but honestly, I like just kind of the old standby that have a pressure dial on the top that look like a really big, kind of probe with a ceramic tip on it that you stick in the soil. I'm actually starting to move away from the expensive and kind of real techie, real-time soil moisture monitoring technology. And I think just with a little bit of legwork, you can kind of use one of those very traditional style tensiometers and monitor it at the right points during your irrigation cycle and understand if you are having saturation or not for much lower cost and in some cases lower headaches than using one of the real time technology that's on the market right now. Maybe someday those will be there for us, but I think that in the Northeast where we don't have drought, 6 months of the year like they do in California and elsewhere where water is much more scarce, I think maybe the simpler technology might be better for us.
There is one more question in the chat, and I know since you're going to run, maybe either you could type it in.
I have 3 minutes, so yeah,
Okay, so
it's up to you to.
yeah, no, I think I think this is a question that comes up a lot for me too, is, a lot of small scale growers are turning to these like deep compost no-till mulch systems with 3 to 5 inches of compost to create a permanent raised bed planted into without incorporation. Would you have concerns about excess phosphorus in this system? And I see a lot of the system on small farms, and I have that question too.
Yeah. So one of those earlier P soil tests that I showed, that was from a similar type system to that. And so, yeah, I mean, part of that showing those slides is kind of like shock value, but there's 2 pieces to the phosphorus loss equations. There's how much phosphorus is in the soil, and then there's the transport piece. Is it connected? Is that in a high tunnel? There's no risk for surface runoff in a high tunnel, right? So I think there's a lot to this equation of how close are you to surface waters? Is it a heavy soil? Is it really prone to runoff? What's the slope of that soil? There's a lot to consider, but the P source is this P concentration in the soil is a very important piece of that, but there's more to the risk equation than just that.
Thanks, Joshua. It's great to have you and all your knowledge. And
thanks, Becky.
If you want to maybe pop your or I'll pop your email into the chat. And Hilary, do you want to start sharing your screen? Hilary Martin is joining us from Mirth Collective Farm in Burlington, and she's going to talk about their nutrient management practices and particularly their phosphorus management. So thanks, Hilary. And just for those of you joining a little bit later, we are having questions in the chat, and we're going to have a pretty hefty, hopefully, conversation towards the end of this, but Hilary can take about 5 minutes of questions after her talk. So handing it over, Hilary.
So hi, everybody. Nice to see so many familiar names. Some of you, a handful I know, but most of you are just famous names on the listserv. Veg and Berry, and thank you, Becky, for organizing us here today. My presentation, I feel like I'm kind of taking you along on our journey, and the journey is not over in terms of trying to hone in on our nutrient management plan. But I'm just gonna kind of take you through who we are and what we do, and how we're trying to get better. And I'm not sure. There we go. Okay. So we are Mirth Collective Farm. We're a certified organic farm. We're located in the Intervale in Burlington, and we manage 13, 14 acres total on 3 different fields, and we're a mixed vegetable market farm, and we're collectively owned. there are five of us who own the farm together. And we're primarily a wholesale farm. We do about 85% of our sales to stores and restaurants. We sell at 2 farmers markets. This year it was just 1. And we did do a tiny pivot and did a little small vegetable share that was distributed to families in the Old North End in Burlington for the pandemic. And about half of those wholesale crops, half of our sales are baby greens, salad greens, mesclun, baby spinach, arugula, and even more are very quick crops. So a lot of our crops are in the ground for like 3 to 6 weeks. But we do a significant number of carrots. That's kind of our 3rd grossing crop, as well as various other mixed vegetables. And we do kind of like a 2/3, 1/3 rotation. So each one of our fields, we do about like 2/3 of it is in vegetable crop every season, and 1/3 of it is in cover. So in total, we've got about 8 acres in vegetables and 4 acres in cover crop at any time. So most of our soils are Winooski very fine sandy loam. We've got beautiful river bottom soil, for which I am grateful every day. Like most river bottom soils, the organic matter is very, very low, like 2 or 3, on the scale. It's very, very low. And also the soils are very well drained. So I just wanted to take you through kind of our nutrient management, and starting with our cover cropping. Honestly, when we are choosing cover crops, we're not exactly prioritizing nutrient management. Weed suppression is basically our sort of number 1 goal. So we're looking for a cover that's going to smother any competing weeds as quickly as possible. And the other kind of piece that we have our eye on is just the timing, and making sure, for example, like a fall cover crop is going to be able to be incorporated in the following spring when we put that field into vegetables. So we kind of like weeds and incorporation are kind of like 1 and 2 in terms of like what cover crop we're going to use. And then second to that, I mean, it's kind of like the whole point is preventing erosion and runoff and increasing organic matter and fixing nitrogen. Like that's why we cover crop. But in terms of like choosing the crop, weeds and incorporation is kind of what we have our eye on. And so what we've really settled on, and we tend to just kind of do the same thing. Once we find something that we like, we sort of stick with it. So first thing in the spring, in our cover crop area, we're going to put field peas and oats, and then we incorporate those in the middle of the summer. And then as soon as we can, behind that, we'll seed Sudan grass. And typically kind of what we were doing was incorporating the Sudan grass and trying to put oats in the fall. And at one point we sort of discovered, because we had to mow the Sudan grass in order to effectively incorporate it. At one point we just noticed that one time we mowed it and it just grew back. And then more recently, we've just kind of been mowing it and let it, and just sort of whether or not it grows back, just kind of having it hold there for the fall, which makes for easier incorporation in the spring. Either way, we like just having 2 cover crops instead of 3 in a season. It prevents us from all of the tillage involved in trying to incorporate a cover crop and plant a new one. This is just kind of a picture to show kind of what it looks like. You know, it takes us 2 or 3 times of turning in the peas and oats, and that's the peas and oats in the background of this picture. And that's probably after the first or maybe even the second disking. And this is the Sudan grass when it's kind of coming in, and it comes in real well. I learned from this workshop that Sudan grass does well with healthy phosphorus loads in the soil. And so that's kind of probably what we're looking at here. And I guess just recapping, you know, for us, we're very, very committed to cover cropping. Like I said, 1/3 of the farm at any point. But if we have weeds coming up through that cover crop, or it's going to get in the way of getting our crops in, it's kind of like that cover cropping plan will go by the wayside. That doesn't happen. It kind of hardly ever happens, but I guess just kind of like real life farming, as you guys know, it's like kind of the vegetables come first when it comes down to it. You know, the other challenge for us being in the Intervale is flooding, and those flood events have come with increased frequency. And that just kind of, I mean, that'll throw a wrench into any plan, but definitely cover cropping. And sometimes it's just sort of like hard to know what's going on, you know, like you have this whole soil health plan, and then you get a flood, and then there's like compaction, and all kinds of things are just sort of like, you know, kind of out the window. So that is always a challenge for us. Here is a typical soil test for us, and we are one of those Chittenden County farms that Josh was talking about earlier. We have huge loads of phosphorus in our soils. And I'm gonna kind of run through a handful of assumptions that we've had for years. First of all, that we have legacy phosphorus, that our phosphorus in our soils came from dairy farmers that came before us in the Intervale. Another assumption that we have always run on, or we used to be running on, is that there is no such thing as too much compost to apply to your soils. That's something I learned in soil science at UVM, that like compost application is the best thing you can do for your soil. And another thing that we have been running on is that phosphorus won't leach in our soils. Now, all of these things have since been debunked. Let's see, I'm kind of skipping through that slide. But, and I think kind of through paying more attention to the science that we know now, we have kind of taken a look at our compost application. We used to apply the compost that came out of the Intervale Compost Project, and when they moved off the Intervale, we switched to Jeru's. If you've done this workshop before or looked, I'm sure you've looked through sources of nitrogen, and Jeru's is just like by far the cheapest way to get nitrogen into soils. And so we had kind of transitioned from compost into Jeru's, applying about the same amount. And when it came to really examining what we were putting down, it was up to about 3 times of the recommended nitrogen. I'm going to just go back, which is always recommended for vegetable growing, 100 to 130 pounds an acre. and sort of doing the math of what we were adding about 375 pounds an acre. So once we realized this, we kind of freaked out, and oh, I'm jumping ahead. And really, we're kind of still, so we still apply the Jeru's composted chicken manure. We're still doing that. Where we're at right now with this is we have slashed the application in half. We're just putting half down and kind of seeing how that affects our yields. And the other kind of piece of this is that we do double crop most of our farm. And so our assumption in sort of putting the Jeru's down is that we were feeding, 2 generations of vegetable crops. And so now what we're doing is in the sandier of our soils, we're kind of putting, we're sort of top dressing with Pro Booster before we put our second planting in. And I'm just noticing the time is going quickly, so I'm gonna kind of, I guess, kind of go into our potassium amending, which is, sorry, going back and forth here, but our potassium levels are sort of fine, and every year we get the recommendation to add about 40 to 100 pounds of potassium an acre. And so here I'm just kind of running through how we calculate how much we use sulfate of potash. So how much sulfate of potash to put down when the recommendation is 40 pounds per acre. So that 51 in the 0051, that's how much potassium there is in a bag of sulfate of potash. So it's 51%. So we assume 25 pounds of potassium per 50-pound bag. And so then we divide the 40 pounds, which is the recommendation, by 25. And we get, in this case, about a little over a bag and a half per acre. And then we kind of figure out our different fields, how much of an acre, and then how many bags to put down. And so you're looking at a sort of an older chart that we were using, and you'll see we were putting down 7 yards, and that kind of represented the old amount of Jeru's and sulfate of potash. We used to use a little bit of peanut meal to start out the field, but we've kind of since realized that that's actually more nitrogen than that we need. And you can see kind of the areas that we're also applying the cover crop. And so now we've kind of, again, we've slashed that composted manure in half. We've eliminated the peanut meal, and we're kind of the same applications with sulfate of potash. And I'll just quickly, here's an old grain drill, which is out of service, but we have another grain drill now, but that's how we're putting down our cover crop seed. This is our manure spreader that we use to spread the composted chicken manure, and that's the flinger, the cone spreader. It's how we put the sulfate of potash down. And then here's Becky when she used to be down at the intervale. We're working on the 6-foot discs. This is our kind of incorporating tool. This is like a sweet tool that we borrowed from our neighbors. That's a spader, and it's taking a mature stand of Sudan grass and turning it in and really prepping the soil for the next round of cover crop seeding. And for a while we really coveted this until we realized how much time you spend changing bearings and cleaning the machine. And now we just kind of skip that third cover crop, which saves us. Here's our scores from the Cornell Soil Health Lab. super high phosphorus. And then also this is just kind of an interesting snapshot of what our soils look like. And I was really shocked when I saw these scores, and actually frankly pretty confused because our soil performs so well and it's so beautiful. And when I looked at this together with Becky, we concluded these sort of lower scores with soil respiration and aggregate stability and surface hardness most likely are due to the frequent flooding at the intervale, but it's still a little bit, you know, it is kind of a shocker to look at all the red in this score. So to date, things that we have done to try to kind of improve our soil fertility regime is we've cut our chicken manure application in half. We've really embraced silage tarps. I didn't really talk about this in the meat of the presentation, but we're tarping for bed prepping in all areas of the farm. And this is really, together with like eliminating that third cover crop, we've reduced tillage probably something like 50%. And so we're really trying to turn the soil a lot less. And that years ago now, but we used to till every single bed up, maybe even twice before we seeded into it. And we've completely eliminated the rototiller from our farm, and instead we use a field cultivator to prep our beds. So really trying to back off on the tillage as well as backing off on the phosphorus application. And in terms of like where to go from here and how to get better, I think hopefully one day we can figure out how to actually just completely stop adding phosphorus to our soils with that chicken manure. But I think while we figure out how much we need it or don't need it, it would be cool to use a more precise tool to apply it instead of that broad spreader. So kind of playing with that would be good. I do think that, you know, looking at some numbers over many years of phosphorus, I do see it going up and down in our soils. So I do think that phosphorus is leaving our field. Going back to one of our assumptions, we didn't really think that it leached, and we don't have soil runoff issues. Oops. What's happening? Let's see. Can you see my, it looks like sharing is paused. What happened?
Huh. I don't know. I just see a gray screen.
Yeah, okay.
Huh.
Bring your shared window to the front. Well, I'm kind of done with the screen anyway, so maybe I should just stop the share. And I can wrap up this way. Oh, maybe my program just died or something. Anyway, so yeah, so I guess one thing that I really would like to see us do is to sort of figure out how and where the phosphorus is moving. Is it leaching, or is it through flood events, or both? And then once, if we can kind of determine what is happening, I would be interested in sort of like, are there things that we can do? Is there bioremediation that we can do? I mean, you know, we've kind of joked about pulling out the Sudan grass from our field and bringing it to some other farm that's phosphorus deficient, but or, you know, there are studies happening with like mycorrhizal remediation. I have no idea how viable that would be, but setting up mycorrhizal communities and hedgerows or something like that. But you know, that's something that I would like to sort of see us look into more in the future. I think I'm over time.
Thanks, Hilary. That's great. And I think that's like the reason why I really love having Hilary present is this is a situation a lot of vegetable farms, especially established farms on flood, kind of nice sandy soils find themselves in. If you've been a compost or manure user, which was the tried and true method for a lot of organic farms for years and years and years, suddenly there's a lot of pressure to reduce phosphorus, and the cost of switching over, it's the cost per pound of nitrogen between the Giroux and like a seed meal, which is really one of the few organic amendments with no phosphorus. It's about 5, 6, 7 times the cost per pound of nitrogen. So when Hilary and I have sat down to do the math, it's quite alarming. Yeah.
If I could just, I don't know, just to kind of put a point on it too, is I feel like maybe I communicated this already, but I really resonated with that, sort of like, we're just a small vegetable farm, like we're the good guys. I don't know. I think kind of heading into looking at our soils and our nutrient management, I didn't really think of ourselves as part of the problem. And at this point, it's like, I feel actually really alarmed and kind of like, okay, we really need to be proactive. And so that's where we're at. An honest look at Digger's Mirth Collective Farm.
Well, the vegetables are still beautiful, so that's the goal. You don't have a lot of questions, Hilary. Somebody asked how sorghum Sudan grass would grow in the Northeast Kingdom, and I think my answer to that is that's a warm, loving cover crop. I think last year it probably would have done fine. You really want to get it established, before mid-July, right?
Yeah.
And it can, I've seen it grow in cooler parts of the state. It might not get as big. It also really likes a lot of nitrogen in the soil. So if you don't have 12,000 pounds of Giroux on your field, you might need to, some people like apply nitrogen actually beforehand, or like Hilary's growing peas and oats. So it feeds on a lot of nitrogen to put on that biomass. So any other questions you can keep posting or talk about afterwards, after Christa goes. And I'd like to welcome Christa from Jericho Settlers Farm, who's going to share her farm's practices with nutrient management, a little bit of a different take on things than Hilary, but a lot to learn from everybody here. So thanks, Christa.
Sure. Share my screen too. I'm glad Hilary had all those beautiful pictures because I have none for you. So, but I do have some words. And so I will share you my notes with you so you can follow along through what we do for soil fertility planning and management at Jericho Settlers Farm. Let me just get that down here. So I'm going to talk just very briefly about our hoop houses, but mostly about our fields because that's where the focus of this talk is. But just to give you a sense of how we manage in the hoop houses too, we have about 2 acres, not quite 2 acres under cover in hoop houses. And we do test those every single year with a saturated media test, as well as some of the ones that are newer in production with a standard soil test as well. They are being cropped constantly and producing a lot. And so we really want to have those nutrients dialed in as precisely as we can. We do fertilize specifically for the summer crops that we're putting in, the tomatoes and cucumbers. They are the higher nutrient need crops. And so we are targeting those. And then we have found that the winter greens that we grow often can grow just on the residual left over from those summer crops. Sometimes if we see like a summer crop petering out near the end of its life and looks like it's a little bit nutrient deficient, we will amend lightly to keep the greens in good health. But ideally we'd do a second set of soil tests in the fall, but we don't. We just time-wise never seem to make that happen. So we use the preceding crop to kind of give us a sense of what the soil is doing and whether or not the winter greens will need anything. But they usually don't use very much, and they, as long as we're keeping our soil balanced overall, they are doing fine. We do try to avoid manure-based fertilizers and compost in the houses, except for some of the ones when they're first getting, when that soil, like if we're turning over an old field and it's becoming a hoop house, we might use compost originally to to get things going, but we tend to avoid manure-based products so that we can reduce the amount of salts we're introducing to those hoop house soils, since they tend to accumulate over time. So in the fields, we're testing about every 4 years. We try to do our field tests every August or September, sometimes a little later, but we try to hit near the end of the season every year, so we're comparing apples to apples. And our main system is that we have we own one and lease one farm, and they have similar tillable acreage, and we do a long-term rotation between those two farms, basically. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but one of them has historically very high phosphorus levels, dairy farm for a long time, and the others are, the other farm is much lower. Our goal, our overall strategy is, as Hilary mentioned, minimizing our P input and trying to focus on N and K specifically for the crops, assuming that the phosphorus is pretty much always there, except unless we're planting into cold soil or something that's just not available yet, but it's in the soil. So our long-term rotation, we did this in concert with livestock when we were raising livestock, but we're no longer doing that, but we still use this rotation and produce forage. We keep one farm in 4 years of vegetable production and the other one's in 4 years of grazing or forage production, with a heavy legume component in that forage. And then we flip-flop, and after 4 years, we move the veggie production to the other farm, and we put the farm that was in vegetable production into long-term perennial cover crop for 4 seasons. And that, you know, we have the luxury of having that land available, and the amount of veggies we're producing right now, that's working well for us. We are doing about 25 to 30 acres per year in field production. Has the added benefits also of breaking pest and disease cycles. So we're moving 7 miles, we're moving the vegetable production 7 miles down the road. It really does help to help break some of those disease cycles and pests, populations building up. We've found, as Hilary mentioned too, like getting your short-term cover crop rotations in place and having everything work and be ready, and having the fields open when you need them and covered when you need them, and it's always really difficult. We also do a lot of fall root crops. We grow a huge amount of fall roots that we store for the winter, and getting those under cover is always challenging because we're harvesting so late out of those fields. So our goal is, to keep the soil covered as much as possible within those different crop cycle needs. But we were finding that we were not getting a lot. We were maybe maintaining some soil health, but we really weren't building our soil health in the long term. And we're really trying to get these soils in better shape than how we inherited them. And so we have gone through to this long-term rotation plan. To get to the nuts and bolts of it, how do we calculate? So in terms of nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, we're looking at our soil tests, and we use the New England Veg Management Guide to help us understand what amounts of those nutrients each crop will need. Those are all addressed in pounds per acre, and so we're calculating those to square footage if we are applying to a small area or by the bed versus by the acre. We do consider N credits from the previous year's application, because a lot of some cover cropping, if we're using areas that we've incorporated cover crops, there's some of that residual still coming out in the second season. Or if we've just turned a cover crop, of course, then we're using a calculation for that as well to estimate nitrogen, potassium credits from that cover crop. We typically will fertilize by the bed. We usually do our beds are about 400 to 500 feet long, and we usually do a block of 8. That's sort of our typical weekly or bi-weekly seeding plan. And we will often fertilize by the bed, but if we're doing, say it's a field that either we have been testing low in nutrients and it makes more sense just to get a bunch of stuff on and go, we will do bulk spreading. And then we're calculating by the acre and not by the square foot. We pretty much put all our nutrients on pre-planting, since most of the organically derived nutrient sources have pretty slow release times with a few exceptions. So we're trying to get that in there and make sure the nitrogen is available when the crop needs it. We do some side dressing for our fall roots, particularly potassium. We use potassium fines, so it's readily available. And that sometimes, depending on what the crop's looking like or what we know we put on originally and what our soil tests were showing, we might side dress some N as well. Ideally, that would be a time where you would do, like a PSNT, but we never do. So, but that would be more informative if we did. We do a lot of salad greens, so we're out early on the soils trying to get spring crops in. And we did at one point, as Becky was mentioning, looking at soy or soybean or other seed meals as an end source, trying to get away from some of the manure-based end sources. And not only is it more expensive, but we also found that release rate is just too slow in the spring for those salad greens. They're, it's like a 20 to 30 day crop. It needs that nitrogen right away. And so like using something like soybean meal just wasn't fast enough for those crops to grow well in the spring, especially if it's a wet spring and things are leaching anyway, which is often the case. So we found if we're usually using crayers, we might mix in a little Chilean if we know the N is really low at the starting time, but typically we haven't had to do that. For longer maturing crops, ones that are going to be in the ground much longer, we will mix in some soybean meal so that there's still some N there later in the season, or we will side dress. That's another option. Most of our fall crops, our goal is that we're putting those on incorporated cover crops that have a legume component. So rye vetch is the one we use most commonly. So the fall before, we're growing that crop through the winter, incorporating it in the spring and working that in. It takes several weeks to get that worked in and get your nutrients releasing. And so those are our fall crops, things that are going in July. Basically, we can use cover crop almost exclusively. Usually we do have to side dress again, but that gives us our main nutrient base right there for things like fall cabbage and beets and carrots. So I talked about some of these already, but we use sulfate fines for potassium, so it's right there ready when we put it down for the crop. Crayer's 543 is what we use because it's the best dollar for, and in pelleted form, there's other, Drew's is out there too. So we've been using both of those, but Crayer's has been easy for us to put on. I mentioned that already. I mentioned all these already. We used to raise livestock. We just stopped in the last year and a half. So we've had some composted chicken manure on site still. But, so we always used to, utilize the waste products from the livestock to fertilize. And so that composted chicken manure, we're working through the last of our piles, and we're typically just putting that on cover crops in the fall, either in fields that are showing low performance, low soil tests, low organic matter. We're trying to boost areas specifically that our tests are telling us needs a little more attention. We use a drop spreader if we're going by bed, a cone spreader if we're spreading a broader area, or we'll lease a bulk spreader from Laws Ag if we're spreading many acres. We don't have our own bulk spreader type thing. If we're using for cover crops, we're flail mowing typically, and then when we might spade if we're doing just several beds. It can take a while to spade, so if we need to just get something incorporated quickly, we'll flip it and disc and harrow versus doing the whole thing with a spader. Bed shaping, use a Lesche bed shaper. We'll stale seed bed or transplant and cultivate. So some crops we can't cultivate, like our salad greens, we're growing baby greens, they don't get cultivated, so those are getting stale seed beds. I mentioned side dressing the way we do it. So we grow our root crops and cabbage to some extent, either 2 or 3 row. Root crops are all 3 rows. So we have just on the cultivating tractor is just a cone that has just 2 tubes that we drop down, mount on a toolbar that are spaced to drop the fertilizer right between the 3. So there's 3 rows, so you're just fertilizing the 2 bands between them and then cultivate that in right away so that it gets incorporated. And I already talked about how we're trying to do this long-term rotation, because it's always been hard for us to get short-term rotations right for cover cropping, or even 1 to 2 season rotations. And we felt like we were like growing something and then, you know, tilling it in, and you know, not even really getting the full benefit out of it sometimes because our window was so short. So the one short-term one we use reliably is a fall seeded rye vetch that gets incorporated the following year after it's gotten a lot of good growth and a lot of good nitrogen fixing going on. We incorporate it, you know, the following year for fall crops. So we're never trying to incorporate something for that in spring planting, because we don't get the benefit out of that cover crop, other than there is a benefit of just having things covered during the winter. That there's that part, but we don't rely on that crop for, you know, nutrient input really, because it's doing so little. It's just grabbing the nutrients that were left and holding on to them, and so we can not lose them, but they aren't really adding much, and honestly not adding much crop residue when it's such a short-term grow. So that's where we do our long-term rotation, which we can really get some species in there that can do some deep tillage with their, like, you know, root tillage with their roots, and get some long-term nitrogen building up. And if we are taking forage off versus grazing, then we do have to think about, sometimes we have to do some added nitrogen inputs depending on how much we're taking off. But sometimes we'll just mow or flail the crop and leave the residue and let that be reutilized by the continually growing perennial crop. So that's my 20-minute talk in 5 minutes. So I can take questions.
Thanks, Christa. That's great. Thanks for spilling the beans on all your secrets of how you grow such great crops. A couple questions for you were about the nitrogen sources you use in your tunnels. And in particular, someone asked about what kind of quick release fertilizer you use for winter greens.
Yeah, so if we need to put something down for greens, we usually mix a little bit of soybean meal with some Chilean, and so the Chilean will just kind of get them going right from the get-go, and the soybean will carry them, you know, a little longer. But they're done most of their growth within a couple months. So, you know, that soybean is probably really only helping them more in the spring if we're overwintering stuff than it is in the winter. But they really don't need much. I mean, we're, you know, like 50 pounds of N per acre is kind of like the standard for greens. We do less than that in the fall. We assume like there's at least something still going on there from the tomatoes and the cukes, because we fertilize so intensely for them. And yes, they use a lot of nutrients, but I've never had them suck everything out. So.
Yeah, and I think, you know, some farms are doing soil tests for tomatoes and then one for the greens, but I think usually we assume there's quite a bit left over from the summer crop. And yeah. I know in the past there's been some concern about luxury consumption of nitrates from greens, which can theoretically be hazardous to our health, but I haven't seen any conclusive studies that's true. Although Vern said to me once, well, it'd only be bad if you're like feeding a baby spinach smoothies every day. I was like, oh, I'll stop doing that then.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, ideally, if you can test again in the fall, if you got your act together and you can get that done, that's great. That's always the most informative.
Yeah, and it's tricky because if we have a warm fall, you guys have all seen how the greens grow more rapidly. If it's a cool fall, they won't do anything with that nitrogen. So,
right.
Another question was, what implement are you using to fertilize by the bed? And that was in the field. Yep.
So just a drop spreader. I don't know, the brand is old, but they're out there. Yeah, and it just basically it straddles the bed and it drops along the bed surface, and you kind of have to, you just have to judge your speed and how much you want to drop down, and just calibrate it and figure that out and then go.
And where are you testing your greenhouse soils? I think that's UMaine, right?
Yes.
So UMaine has a couple different options. If you go there, they've been really great to work with because they've collaborated with a lot of other extension folks in New England to provide specific high tunnel recommendations. So I steer people towards them, and they have a long-term high tunnel option. Christa mentioned there's a field soil test. If you have a new high tunnel, you could save a little money and just do the field soil test. There's a short-term high tunnel and long-term high tunnel test. So UMaine's website's pretty good for that. Tim's asking about your preferred cover for 4-year rotation.
Yeah, so we're only starting the second one now. So originally what we did was a mix specifically. We were raising sheep at that time for lamb meat production. So we did a mix specifically, for grass-fed pasturing, basically. It had, oh gosh, Champion mix was the base. I'll have to look up everything that was in it. I just had that out. And it's a mix of grasses and clovers primarily. We also used some nurse crop of oats and peas when we started it to get it established. I wouldn't say I'm an expert in this. So if you want really good advice on that, I would talk to the UVM Extension folks who specialize in this grazing stuff, because they certainly know more than I do on that. But we were we were planting specifically for, we tried a couple different things, and the grass clover mixes that we came up with worked the best and lasted the longest on the fields.
And how do you spread potassium fines initially and side dress?
Yeah, so we're usually mixing them in either with some crayers or some soybean meal so to help distribute them, because the percent that, or the bulk amount that you're putting down is a lot less than your bulk nitrogen. So you can't just like put one bag in the hopper and hope that you can get it all spread the way you want. So we're usually mixing it in with something else. That's
good. Yeah, the fines are really powdery. They would be hard to, I think, spread mechanically, or I don't know.
We kind of, as we're filling, we're kind of layering it in and mixing it into the cone or the drop spreader as we're filling, so that it's not all just sitting in one spot in there. Cool.
Last question is, what are you doing differently for the high P field versus the low P field?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we have the same struggle that Hilary talked about, and like trying to convert away from a fertilizer base that has any phosphorus in it. It's very hard to do cost-wise. That long-term perennial cropping that we're doing is helping. I actually just looked at our 2015 test versus our 2020 test for those high P fields. And in a couple of them, like, so high P, they were running, like 130 pounds per acre kind of thing for phosphorus. That's the numbers we were getting from this historic dairy farm. And we've been able to bring a couple of those fields down to half of that in 5 years. So they're running around 60 to 70 now. One of them started at like 200 and it's now at 150. So that one's proving a little more challenging. And I say fields, these are all like blocks within one field. We just test all these different blocks differently because we manage them crop wise differently. I think that 4-year forage / perennial crop is helping in terms of some removal there, but also we didn't throw down fertilizer on it we didn't throw phosphorus on it for 4 years. And then our other goal is, by doing these calculations, we're trying to be as minimal with our N application as we can be. So we're putting down as little phosphorus at the same time with that blended fertilizer. So as Hilary mentioned, like making sure we're only putting down what the plants really need. So we have not switched away from a totally phosphorus deficient fertilizer. It's just cost wise, we haven't been able to do that. But we are trying to be really conservative with what we are applying, making sure it's only what the crop's going to need. And then in the case of the crops that are out of the field soon enough, of course, getting a fall cover crop on there to hold on to whatever's in there, so that we can utilize it again when we incorporate that crop. So no rocket science there, nothing, no magic bullets yet, but Becky's going to come up with that and let me know.
Working on it. Thank you, Christa and Hilary, and Joshua's not here anymore. I'm dropping in the chat a link to an evaluation that's very quick to do. We have our funding for these workshops from the Vermont Agency of Agriculture. They provide clean water funds. So we have to kind of show them that this is happening and that you're hopefully getting something out of it. And I just wanted to take a quick second to wrap up here and just mention that we have this new, I think a lot of you heard about it already, but a new soil health platform on the VVBGA website. And I'm available to help anybody interpret soil tests, come up with a plan, talk about cover cropping. Love to do that if you haven't, if I can help in any way. Outside of these workshops, please let me know. Usually we build in a couple hours in the workshop of one-on-one assistance. So please contact me if I can be helpful. And the website, I know we've all heard a million things about the RAPs in Vermont. The website is a really simple way to just get your records in a safe place easily, and hopefully help you keep records from year to year. And again, I'm super happy to help walk you through that and get your records on there. And if you don't have records, you can build them on the website. So just showing you here what it looks like. If you don't have a account yet, it's vvbga.org. I can drop that in the chat, but it'll give you the opportunity to enter your field name, the year, the size, and walks you through the planning, the record keeping, cover cropping, erosion. So it's all the things in the required agricultural practices, and hopefully things that would be beneficial for you to keep track of anyway. I know we're all spending way too much time on the computers, so sorry about that. Hopefully it's quick and easy. So this is just what it looks like. Happy to help with anybody. We worked with a really great web developer. If you're in CAPS, this looks familiar because it's the same website and same person helped design it. So anyway, that was all I wanted to hop on. Hey, there's that picture from Hilary's farm that I stole. And the cool thing is you can sort by field or by year. So you have like a whole inventory, and you can download or edit like a CSV. So if you need to send it or share it, even like to me or to Vern or to your farm crew, hopefully this is a useful tool for your farm team. So that is it. And next week, I'm really excited about this conversation about tillage, reducing tillage, and cover cropping. So we've got this lineup of speakers, Silas, Andrew, Ryan, and Spencer. And then the next week, we're going to talk about the economics behind some of these decisions. It's a little bit new for me, dipping my toes into that conversation. Would love input if you have ideas of things you'd like to hear about. Betsy Miller and Zach Smith from the Ag Business team are going to be on, and they're excited to kind of field questions. It'll hopefully be more of a roundtable. And then the last week we're doing a crop by crop. I'm calling it a crop by crop lightning round, and I'm soliciting ideas. If you guys, any of you want to share like 2 to 3 slides and you're like best of for crop nutrient management practices, let me know if you're interested in sharing. I'm thinking, you know, treading the line between giving away all your secrets, your trade secrets, and also just helping figure out some of those tricky crops to grow. I know there's a few fussy things out there that trip everybody up. So just thinking about sharing some of those ideas. So let me know, and please fill out the evaluation I threw in the chat. And any other questions, thoughts before we wrap up? Yeah, Sue, you're welcome to use it. The website is a VVBGA website, and you have to be a member to use it, but you are, so you are all welcome outside of Vermont to use it. All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Christa, Joshua, Hilary, and everybody joining. Please be in touch and enjoy the sunshine today. Thanks, everybody.